And our top story tonight, right now, is about this. These troops in the streets from California to D.C. And as many people asked across this long summer, how can this be happening in America? How is this legal? And tonight, the answer, fresh from the federal courts, is this is not legal. Donald Trump's deployment of troops to patrol Americans is illegal. And it smacks of an illicit bid to create Trump's own national police force, a police state. And that is according to a federal judge. And I'm going to walk you through the ruling. It's a key setback for Trump's bids to seize unitary powers and wield them against you, against us, against Americans. A judge ruling President Trump cannot deploy the National Guard and Marines the way he did in L.A., that it is illegal. The ruling, of course, follows long-standing precedent, which many experts cited when Trump first put these troops in the streets. We reported that at the time. The ban on soldiers patrolling citizens is well known in this country. Anyone with U.S. military experience or legal experience or any recent interaction with a history textbook, quite frankly, knows the limit. It's under a 19th century law, posse comitatus, and the judge ruled Congress has forbidden the president to use the army for the purpose of executing general laws. That's just a fancy way of saying for law enforcement, except when expressly authorized by the Constitution or an act of Congress. This ruling against Trump also has some damning evidence, how the Trump administration's own training materials note the law barred troops from doing the things Trump wanted them to do. You can see it here. This is a PowerPoint training slide that was included in this ruling against Trump today. And I'm not going to read all of it, but it's bad for the Trump administration because it shows how these very troops, under these legal restrictions, were warned the Posse Comitatus Act, PCA, prohibits them from law enforcement functions on Americans, like traffic control or crowd control. And the judge found Trump appears to have an illicit purpose of calling National Guard troops into other cities across the country, thus creating a, quote, national police force with the president as its chief. Now, that's a warning about the kind of autocratic national police forces that we tend to see in other countries, in less democratic countries. The judge saying no national police force should operate like that in America under Trump or any leader. Not a partisan statement, not a blue or red thing, but that we are not a police state and we're not about to become one when we have actual laws followed and judges overseeing the government. Now, rhetoric about Trump can be intense in politics. And he, of course, did try to steal the 2020 election that he lost. And lately, he's been musing repeatedly about being a, quote, dictator, or why some people like some things dictators do. But this is not politics, what I'm telling you about tonight. And this is not Democrats warning about him or trying to make him sound really bad for potentially their own purposes. This is the concern based on the evidence from a measured federal judge. A judge who's noticed that the kind of sweeping police force powers Trump is seeking could also be used to push the military into our elections. Again, not some Democrat doing scare tactics or excuses about losing the last election. This is a judge noting that under what Trump's DOJ is saying right now, they argue that they can have the president send troops basically anywhere to help enforce basically any federal law, which is never how it's been. You don't have soldiers showing up to audit your taxes, even though, of course, the president oversees the tax laws through the IRS, but not through the military. Pretty basic. So in this new ruling, the judge notes that Trump's DOJ's argument is so extreme, he says, could President Trump assert he's unable to enforce obscure tax laws and then use the federalized National Guard to execute a range of laws? And he brings up specifically, quote, the election laws. This is a ruling about Trump acting illegally. The concern is that he would use military powers not to better enforce election laws illegally. No, I think it's pretty clear to interfere in the election itself if he lost, or in the vote counting if he thinks he might lose. And this is not a hypothetical. There's been extensive reporting, the Jan 6 committee, and our own chart, if you recall, of the 2020 plots Trump tried, some of them indicted. And if you look down there at the black one, which was not indicted because it was abandoned, it was Trump's effort, his exploration of if he could get the military to seize voting machines. He wanted to do this then. In fact, his later convicted lawyer, Sidney Powell, was going to be some kind of election prosecutor in that effort. It was discarded when Giuliani said it went too far. I repeat, when Giuliani said it went too far. So tonight, judges are sounding the alarm. They are trimming Trump's powers as he vows to appeal the case, which is his legal right. So this goes up to the appeals and the Supreme Court in a process we've seen. And Trump lost this round. But I got to tell you, it's also notable that the administration's approach, seizing powers, threatening to defy courts, then trying to run out the clock, it still got them months of troops in the streets of L.A. before this setback today. Remember, that L.A. deployment began back in early June.
It's Orwellian. Simply lying to people. Unconstitutional, illegal act, his mess. We're trying to clean it up.
We're going to have troops everywhere. We're not going to let this happen to our country.
There's a protocol. There's a process. He didn't care about that.
What are the troops in L.A. to do? And that is unclear to pretty much everybody at this time.
I, in partnership with Governor Gavin Newsom, are suing President Trump.
California may be first, but it clearly will not end here. Other states are next. Democracy is next.
Other states were next, including later our capital. You could like Gavin Newsom or not. You could think he's standing up strong or showboating. But the things he said then, having clashed with Trump and dealt with him, have been borne out. And legally, this round goes to Newsom. He's fought harder than some of these D.C. Democrats. You have to put an MIA out to find Chuck Schumer a lot of these weeks. And the governors are stepping up. But let's be clear about the facts. When judges rule against Trump this way, this long since June, many are still using the old rules and timelines that do effectively reward Trump for abusing power in the meantime. As a matter of practical impact, I'm not telling you how it could be or should be. I'm telling you how it is, best we can see from the evidence. Practically, today shows that Trump, according to this judge, was illegal, is trying to build a police state that's not allowed, and blatantly violated these limits on troops in the streets. But it also shows how the Steve Bannon playbook of flooding the zone, moving fast, and testing who will keep up or stop anything in real time is also still working. And the president is not exactly chastened for his use of these powers in D.C. or L.A. or elsewhere. He is now threatening to send troops to, other places like Chicago. So this is serious. The courts are finding that Trump's goal is not cutting crime. It's a personalized police state, which other leaders have used to try to steal elections and end democracy. It's not a Harris October talking point. It's what judges are finding. And Trump's talking about crime, but the whole point is not whether there is sometimes terrible crime in our country, like in Chicago this weekend, there definitely was. But that, as I told you at the top of the news tonight, our laws restrict soldiers trained for war, armed for war, from using that war training on our own people, on you. If this weren't actually happening, it would seem unnecessary to state this. You might turn on the news and think, why are they Constitution-splaining to me? Of course, the guys in the camo to fight over there aren't supposed to be over here in my neighborhood pointing weapons of war at random civilians. Of course not. And yet here we are. As for the threat to go elsewhere, the Democratic governor of Illinois responding today.
First, I want to address the president's unhinged remarks a few minutes ago, begging me to call him. No, I will not call the president, asking him to send troops to Chicago, to Chicagoans. What you can do is look out for your communities and your neighbors. Know your rights. Film things that you see happening in your neighborhoods. Authoritarians thrive on your silence. Be loud.
Authoritarians thrive, says a governor. Be loud, he says to the citizens. Citizens who have spent months in L.A. watching camouflaged soldiers walk around, which is what's happening still today in our capital. No police state, say the judges, but are they saying it as loud as the governor says we need, and are they saying it fast enough? Your thoughts?
So my thought today is sort of twofold. One is right now in Brazil, a former president is on trial for engaging allegedly, in an insurrection. He lost the election. He said he won. And we like to think of ourselves as exceptional, and we're at the vanguard, and our legal system is at the very top of the world in terms of the rule of law. That's not true. The rule of law is functioning in Brazil. It's notable that Donald Trump has been taking Brazil to task precisely because they are holding their former president to the rule of law. It is refreshing to see Judge Breyer in California do the same today. And I thought there was another part of the opinion that was refreshing. He used the testimony of current military people who testified, who understood that they were not allowed to violate the Posse Comitatus Act.
Right, and the trainings we saw.
Exactly. And they said that what we were being asked to do, we were not supposed to do. We understood that if we were called in, we had a limited role. We were not supposed to engage in law enforcement that is against the law. It was so notable that this is the government's own witnesses were saying this, when the government lawyer's position was, oh, the Posse Comitatus Act is an irrelevancy. The president can do whatever he wants. And it was so heartening to see that the law enforcement people who were on the stand were like, no, that's not how we were trained. That's not something we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to be functioning as law enforcement in our own country.
What does it tell you that the judge was so concerned that this is the outlines of a police state? And
Absolutely.
that's not an op-ed. It's not an angry podcast. It's a judge looking at what the evidence is.
The Trump family is making billions off of crypto. World Liberty Financial, the venture co-founded by the president's three sons, has earned the family $5 billion in paper wealth after it opened trading on a new digital currency, making it available for buying and selling on the open market. According to the Wall Street Journal, the trading debut was most likely the biggest financial success for the president's family since the inauguration, and cryptocurrency is likely now the Trump's most valuable asset, exceeding their decades-old property portfolio. Joining us now, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Michigan, Justin Wolfer, is co-founder and director of economic policy at Veda Partners, Henrietta Trace, and managing editor of The Bulwark, and MSNBC contributor Sam Stein. So, Sam, why might this, if this was not Trump or some other president, why might people say, wait a minute, how much money are you making, and who exactly is contributing this cash, and where is it coming from? Is this the same? Could you say this is like the Trump Hotel, except, amplified by $1 million? $1 billion, $5 billion.
By $1 billion, by $5 billion. No, this is all above board, Katie. We should not even care. No, of course, it's crazy. We've never seen in our history anything remotely like this, in which the president's family is creating what is paper wealth, but still wealth, $5 billion, while they are accumulating political power, and doing it in such a way that is kind of openly allowing for the corruption of the business. We've seen instances of people who are seeking presidential favors, invest in Trump businesses, and ultimately receive such favors. We've seen no effort by the Trump family to try to shield in any way, in any significant way at least, the president from the appearance of conflict of interest. And of course, there is just a basic conflict of interest here in that the federal government is in the process of crafting new regulations for cryptocurrency. And Trump has been very open about the idea that he wants very few regulations, that he's going to be a crypto president. And they have been outward about the fact that they want to invest and profit from this new crypto venture. And so you have a confluence of factors here that is unlike anything we've ever seen in terms of the corruption of the presidency. But with Trump, it's so blatant and it's so public that it tends to become like the, 23rd or 24th most important story of the day.
What is the visibility that we have into this crypto venture, Justin? Do we have any idea who's buying this stuff, who's selling it?
Yes. So one of the venture, one part of the venture is what's called a stable coin, which is here's an asset that's worth $1, and we promise it'll always be worth $1. By the way, if anyone wants an asset worth $1, it's called a $1 bill. You can just get them from any bank. But those stable coins, the value of those is currently being held up by Binance. The former CEO of Binance is in jail right now, sort of hoping for a bit of a pardon. And so right there's your conflict of interest. But there's something deeper here, Katie. It's quite possible the next financial crisis is a crypto crisis, that all of a sudden the value of these things goes to zero. Now, this whole thing's just a casino. And if Vegas goes bankrupt, we let them go bankrupt. But if the president goes down with it, I have a funny feeling there might be a bailout. And it's a bailout of yours and my money to keep a bunch of grifters rich. And I think it's a very, very big worry for the future of financial stability.
All right, so there's the crypto venture. By the way, I mean, I'd be crazy not to mention that the Republicans were going after President Biden's son, Hunter Biden, claiming that he was selling and peddling influence while the president was not just the vice president, but also a senator for a long time. I don't understand what the difference is between what would they argue the difference is between what Hunter Biden was allegedly doing and what Donald Trump's 3 adult sons have been doing with many things, including crypto?
Well, I think that the thing you're failing to understand here, Katie, is Hunter Biden was a very bad artist, and his art was terrible. The president's sons are crypto geniuses, each and every one of them financial wizards. Not only are they financial wizards, they're also social media giants and businessmen of the highest order. So the moment the Trump name goes to anything, of course, it's a return purely to the genius of these brilliant young men and not at all about corruption. At least I think that's the official story.
Henrietta, we've been watching the markets. They've been down today. This is Donald Trump's trying to blame the court ruling against his tariffs, saying the reason the markets are down is because he's not allowed to impose his tariffs, even though they, by the way, are still in place. And then he argues that without these tariffs, we won't have a country. Is that what's going on?
Well, it's kind of an interesting dynamic. There's a little bit of all of this tied into it. Right now, we have sort of a tale of two markets, which is that the bond markets are telling you that without the estimated $4 trillion in revenue that the president is collecting off of these tariffs that are paid for by U.S. consumers, we're not going to have enough money to be able to handle our debt load, let alone our interest load. And what would happen in that scenario is that it would become very apparent that the one big beautiful bill that is the most expensive tax bill that has ever passed in U.S. history actually adds so much to the debt, even after kicking 12 million people off of Medicaid, that they are going to look at a serious problem with U.S. treasuries, U.S. bond markets, and the rest. And that's what investors are starting to digest now. We held a conference call with international lawyers on Saturday for our clients right after the ruling came out on Friday night, and they give 65% odds to the Supreme Court holding up what 2 other courts already have, which is to say these tariffs are null and void. The president does not have this authority. And then you have on the other side retailers like Walmart and Target and Dollar General who are saying, oh, thank God, we don't have to pay these tariffs now. We don't have to pass 60% tariffs on to consumers if our good comes in from Vietnam or Indonesia or the Philippines, because they have a 20% IEEPA tariff plus a trans-shipping tariff. So it's really a lot to digest for markets, and the chaos that we're seeing is really a come-to-Jesus moment that I imagine will last for at least another couple months.
That's interesting. So if the tariffs don't stand, the Supreme Court rules the same way the lower courts have ruled. Who gets that money back? How does that money get refunded?
That's the question of the hour. There's going to be questions about whether there can be one giant civil court case or whether every single importer is going to have to go and ask for a refund individually. And they'll go to Customs and Border Patrol and they'll say, hey, yo, give me my money back. And by the way, I want interest. So there is no Treasury working group digesting this right now. So it's going to be a bit of a quagmire for a while. But for the markets right now, it's not really about the $150 billion or so that the administration has raised so far. It's about the $3 trillion that they're expected to raise over the next decade. So it gets a little lost there.
Hopefully you spent this past holiday weekend enjoying time with your loved ones. I know I did. It was great. But if you happened to peek onto social media at any point over the last few days, you may have seen people started speculating without any real, actual acute evidence that something bad happened to Donald Trump. Now, it's true that until today, the president had not spoken publicly in a week, And this past weekend, his public schedule was very light, a lot of time on the golf course. Something about that combination got the rumor mill turning. People shared images of this little bruise on the president's hand, which is not uncommon for a man of his advanced age. Others shared photos like this one showing what outlets like the Daily Beast have referred to disparagingly as Trump's cankles. Again, there's a non-life-threatening medical explanation for that. Trump has been diagnosed with chronic venous insufficiency, which is a common condition that can cause, pretty intense swelling of the ankles like you see there. Still, the rumors managed to get enough traction that Minnesota's Democratic Governor Tim Walz seemed to acknowledge them at a Labor Day event yesterday.
Thank you all for coming out today. Thank you for believing in these times, because, look, I get it. You get up in the morning and you doom scroll through things, and although I will say this, the last few days you woke up thinking there might be news. Just saying. There will be news sometime, just so you know, there will be news.
I mean, not just, people that are not big fans of the president, but even Trump's allies have been speculating about his poor health.
So as the crisis gets worse, and it's going to get worse, because you can see him declining faster and faster, I predict Trump is going to have some type of collapse within the next 12 months at the current trajectory. I'm not saying he's going to collapse. I'm saying if he doesn't take his foot off the gas pedal, I guarantee you.
Now, Alex Jones is not a medical doctor, not someone that you should really listen to about these matters. And in the end, all the rumor mongering and speculation appears, at least for now, to be totally baseless. As we saw today, the president of the United States is very much alive and seemingly as well as ever, for what that's worth. Although he was asked about the rumors in the Oval Office today, which was a strange moment, and we'll have his answer next.
How did you find out over the weekend that you were dead? You see that?
No.
People didn't see you for a couple days. 1.3 million user engagements as of Saturday morning about your demise.
Really? I didn't see that. I have heard, it's sort of crazy, but last week I did numerous news conferences, all successful. They went very well, like this is going very well. And then I didn't do any for 2 days, and they said there must be something wrong with him.
There you have it. The president of the United States is alive and, well, his typical self. But while the online speculation over the long weekend turned out to be just that, the growing curiosity about Trump's well-being might be at least a bit understandable, considering that this White House has not given us any reason to trust what it says on just about anything, especially when it comes to the health of a man who is the oldest to ever take the oath of office. Jamelle Bouie is an opinion columnist for the New York Times. Tim Miller is a former spokesman for the RNC, now writer-at-large for The Bulwark, and they join me now. Tim, I found that I mostly did stay off social media this weekend, but when the times where I sort of managed to dip in, I was like, wait, what's going on? Did I miss something? Did actually something happen? And why do you think there is this sort of phenomenon that has been gathering force recently?
Yeah, I thought about wearing my white lab coat for this segment, Chris, but I decided not to. I think that this phenomenon is based around a few things. One, Donald Trump is extremely, extremely old. And so people have speculation about him. I think that number two, as you alluded to, they lie about everything. And I think that his last medical report said he weighed he had the physique of Cincinnati Bengals quarterback Joe Burrow, I'm pretty sure, as far as height and weight is concerned. And so they lie about his health. And so when you have things like weird bruises on your hands and huge cankles, and you're not in public for 48 hours, in a different administration, in the Jimmy Carter or George H.W. Bush administration, they would have provided a statement and people would have believed them, right? And they don't, this administration, you can't do that. So I think that's another reason things get out of hand. And, look, the only thing, I have one maybe agreement with Alex Jones, maybe a disagreement with some viewers on this point. But the one other thing that drives this is Trump does have an insane schedule. I mean, he has a very, very public schedule. It's not like he's a coal miner or whatever. It's not a physical job, but he's a 79-year-old man who's out talking like 5 hours a day in front of cameras and yes. and traveling internationally. If you've ever traveled with a senior citizen internationally, do you think when they land, they're going to do a 2-hour press conference? So he keeps a very intense schedule, and then he went away for 3 days, and I think he was probably worn out, and I think that led to the speculation.
Jamelle, I saw a few people make this point, which really stuck with me. about people who had been in societies that were not democracies, where there's some authoritarian leader, and how common it is when the leader disappears for a little period of time for this speculation about like the health or the death of said leader, that this is like a real trope in closed societies, authoritarian societies. And that chilled me a little bit and also felt like it had a little kernel of truth to it.
Yeah, it does, I think, have a small kernel of truth to it, that we are already, I think, collectively getting acculturated to looking at the president in this manner as some sort of like leader who has to be present all the time, or people start getting concerned, worried, I think in this case a little excited that something may have happened. I think it's a funny reflection of how central the presidency has become to American political culture. That there is this kind of constant obsession about where the president may be, if they're in the public eye, if they're doing something. And I find that, I mean, separate and apart from Trump, I find the centrality of the president to everything we think about American politics to be not good, to be actually kind of one of the things that has fed into how we've got to where we are today.
I totally 100% agree with that. And I do think also, Tim, part of what's driving it as well is I think there's a sense a lot of people had that there was a lot of speculation about Biden's health. There was a lot of talking about Biden's health. There's been even a long sort of mea culpa, sort of self-recrimination in some of the press that there wasn't enough talk about Biden's health. And I think some people are like, well, this guy is like super old and does clearly have some physical issues in front of him, and also does seem to like blank out sometimes, or like his brain seems mushy, although is it any mushier than it was before? I don't know. And a little bit of like frustration that it's not like even Steven, I guess. Yeah.
I think that there's probably some of that. It's also on people's mind, right? I mean, like the gerontocracy side of this thing. Yes. You also had Mitch McConnell, froze a couple of times recently. We've had this in several other cases. So I think that is something that leads to it. But I could not agree more with Jamel, just by the way, just both on this notion that like this does carry echoes of what you see in other countries. I forget, I was talking to one of my colleagues today. I was talking about how I was reminiscent of how, Castro was dying for 20 years. And then finally happened. It was too late. I do think there's a little bit of something to that for sure, and that it reflects poorly on how the centrality of the presidency in our lives right now. Yeah, there was a line about someone posted this, and it really stuck with me, Jamel, that in 1997, in 2007, in 2017, and possibly in 2027, the president was born in the same year in all of those years. Like, we've gone now from like Bill Clinton through like that. It's just the same generation still there as time marches forward.
I mean, there's an interesting observation to make here just about the durability of whatever the Trump coalition is, precisely like looking at his age, looking at the fact that the president, this is the oldest person to take the oath of office, president who's pushing 80, who seems exhausted, and whose victory last year was not nearly as substantial as I think people remember it being. It was sort of the best possible headwinds for Trump, and he barely assembled a winning coalition. And there's one way to look at all of this and to see it not as, a triumphant president on the march, but a quite exhausted one, both literally and politically, attempting to burrow itself into power as much as it possibly can in the short amount of time that it has.
Yeah, and I think part of it, too, is that people have a sense or a hope that he's sui generis and the forces he's unleashed can't be sort of passed around to someone else. And I think that, I don't know if that's going to prove true or not, but I think people do have that hope. Jamelle Bouie, Tim Miller, thank you both.
To do my best to share what we know as of today and speak frankly to the people of Illinois. Rumors have been swirling about what the White House has planned, and sifting fact from fiction has been increasingly difficult because Donald Trump's administration is not working in coordination with the city of Chicago, Cook County, or the state of Illinois. I want to take a moment at the top of my remarks to note how truly extraordinary it is for the federal government to refuse to coordinate with local law enforcement and government. Our state police regularly works with the FBI, the ATF, the DEA to go after gangs and gun runners and drug cartels. Under previous White House administrations, we regularly received notice and worked together on crime-fighting operations. This city has hosted major political conventions, flashpoint events like the NATO conference, and huge sports and entertainment gatherings over the years and across many presidential administrations. All those events required significant coordination between all levels of government. Some, like the Democratic National Convention last year, even required a limited deployment of the Illinois National Guard for broad security purposes, including especially preventing terrorism. For that four-day event, there were conversations and meetings that began 1 year before the convention between my office, the mayor's office, the county board president's office, CPD, state police, the FBI, the Secret Service, and the Department of Homeland Security. The mayor and I were briefed at the highest levels of government, and we pledged unwavering support in the effort to pull off a convention that kept attendees safe and protected the rights of all citizens to express their First Amendment rights. The convention was a true success because of that collaboration. Fighting crime requires coordination. We have experienced nothing like that over the past several days and weeks. On Saturday, the head of the Illinois State Police received a phone call from CBP's Chief Patrol Agent, Gregory Bovino, indicating that ICE would be deploying to Chicago. It's the first outreach we have received from the Trump administration on this topic. Bovino was short on details and long on rhetoric. So in the absence of significant federal coordination, we've gathered information from unauthorized patriotic officials inside the government and from well-sourced reporters about Donald Trump's plan, which is to deploy armed military personnel to the streets of Chicago. I'm aware that the President of the United States likes to go on television and beg me to call and ask him for troops. I find this extraordinarily strange, as Chicago does not want troops on our streets. I also have experience asking the president for assistance, just to have the rug pulled out from underneath me when execution meets reality. I refuse to play a reality game show with Donald Trump again. What I want are the federal dollars that have been promised to Illinois and Chicago for violence prevention programs that have proven to work. That is money that Illinois taxpayers send to the federal government, and it's an insult to any and every citizen to suggest that any governor should have to beg the president of any political party for resources owed their people. I'd like to ask a question of my own, and it's one the press should be asking as well. When did we become a country where it's okay for the U.S. president to insist on national television that a state should call him to beg for anything, especially something we don't want? Have we truly lost all sense of sanity in this nation, that we treat this as normal? As I have done since becoming governor, I've been reflecting on my responsibilities to the people of Illinois. And one of those duties is to share with the public exactly what we know. In the coming days, we expect to see what has played out in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., to happen here in Chicago. First, Donald Trump is positioning armed federal agents and staging military vehicles on federal property, such as the Great Lakes Naval Base. It is likely those agents will be with ICE Customs and Border Patrol, the Department of Homeland Security, and other similarly situated federal agencies. Many of these individuals are being relocated from Los Angeles for deployment in Chicago. We believe that staging that has already begun started yesterday and continues into today. Second, unidentifiable agents in unmarked vehicles with masks are planning to raid Latino communities and say they're targeting violent criminals. As we saw in Los Angeles, a very, very small percentage of the individuals they will target will be violent criminals. Instead, you're likely to see videos of them hauling away mothers and fathers, traveling to work or picking up their kids from school. Sometimes they will detain, handcuff, and haul away children. They are law-abiding individuals who pay taxes and contribute to the communities who feel safe going to work and attending mandatory immigration check-ins. In other words, they're following the law. We have reason to believe that Stephen Miller chose the month of September to come to Chicago because of celebrations around Mexican Independence Day that happen here every year. It breaks my heart to report that we have been told ICE will try and disrupt community picnics and peaceful parades. Let's be clear, the terror and cruelty is the point, not the safety of anyone living here. Third, as lawful citizens exercise their First Amendment rights, Trump and his team will be looking for any excuse to put active duty military on our streets, supposedly to protect ICE. We have reason to believe that the Trump administration has already begun staging the Texas National Guard for deployment in Illinois. I want to be very clear on this point, and I want to speak directly to the press right now. We know before anything has happened here that the Trump plan is to use any excuse to deploy armed military personnel to Chicago. If someone flings a sandwich at an ICE agent, Trump will try and go on TV and declare an emergency in Chicago. I'm imploring everyone, if and when that happens, do not take the bait. Lastly, after about 30 days or so, we believe that they will pick up all of those resources that they send here to Chicago and send them to the next city in a blue state, ignoring cities in red states with higher violent crime rates than we have. None of this is about fighting crime or making Chicago safer. None of it. For Trump, it's about testing his power and producing a political drama to cover up for his corruption. If you need any proof of this, that it's all a big show, well, look at who they're putting in charge. Gregory Bovino, a guy who desperately wants to be a reality TV star. He led the cruel adventures of ICE in Los Angeles, and he's been sent here to do the very same thing. Go look at his social media. He terrorizes innocent people and then posts on TikTok edits of himself. Apparently, this is a Trump administration norm, because the last time we saw staged major ICE raids in Chicago, they sent Dr. Phil here to embed with the agents so he could get views and likes for his social media. When Bovino pulled these stunts in LA, people got hurt. 2 innocent people died trying to flee his masked agents. ICE opened fire on a vehicle without dangerous provocation. They detained a disabled 15-year-old, drew their guns on him. They have ripped mothers away from their babies and handcuffed 10-year-olds. In Washington, they pulled over firefighters headed to fight an actual wildfire and detained 2 of the firefighters on duty in that effort. And they want to bring all of that to Chicago. During one of Bovino's raids, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol's own data indicated that their officers had no prior knowledge of criminal or immigration history for 77 of the 78 people arrested. Again, this is not about crime. More and more reports around these raids include people who were stopped or detained because of how they look and not because of any threat to the public. If any of this was about dealing with the complexities of a broken immigration system, then Trump would have had the Congress Trump Republicans control write and pass a comprehensive immigration bill. Not only has that not happened, there is no talk of any such effort on the horizon. I know how Donald Trump thinks because I've been governor during both of his terms. He has surrounded himself with groveling yes men who are too weak to restrain his most violent and unhinged impulses, or who share those impulses. As a governor who cares about the well-being of my people, I can't live in a fantasy land where I pretend Trump is not tearing this country apart for personal greed and power. I have to deal in facts, and here they are. Crime is down in Chicago. Murders are down by almost 50% in the last 4 years. Shootings are down 57%. Robberies down 34%. Burglaries down 21%. Motor vehicle thefts down 26%. One violent crime is too many, and we have more work to do. But we have made important progress on safety that Trump is now jeopardizing.
You know, first of all, community safety is my top priority. As mayor of the city of Chicago, it's what I think about every single day. All of my efforts that I have instituted since I've been mayor have been driven towards driving violence down in the city of Chicago. This has been a challenge for well over 60 years. And in part because of gross disinvestment, and previous administrations took an approach that, quite frankly, exacerbated the challenges in our community. And what I've said from the very beginning, the safest communities in America have one thing in common: they invest in people. And that's what we've done. We've invested in youth employment. We've grown that by over 50%. We've expanded mental and behavioral health care services. We're building more affordable housing to stabilize our communities. And then we've invested in our Detectives Bureau, because one of the challenges that we've had in Chicago for too long is that when violence does occur, justice is not rendered. And so we have a clearance rate now of nearly 77% where we are bringing people to justice. It's clear that this is not about safety for President Trump, because if it were, he would not have cut over $800 million from violence prevention programs like what we have in the city of Chicago, where we have CVI workers that are working to disrupt violence. If this were about safety, he would not have cut, the ATF budget by nearly 30%. My police department has collaborated with the federal government to get illegal guns off the streets of Chicago. Just a couple of weeks ago, we took over 170 guns off the streets of Chicago. Many of them have switches or attachments that allow for guns to be turned into machine guns. These are severe, high-power weapons. If the president was serious about safety, he would go into the red states where guns are being trafficked from, like Mississippi, Indiana, that come into the city of Chicago and cause the type of violence that we saw just this past weekend.
Mm-hmm. Mayor, we've watched similar acts unfold in Los Angeles, in Washington, D.C. In fact, just today, you had Mayor Bowser issue an executive order. It requires local coordination with federal law enforcement, quote, to the maximum extent allowable by law within the district. The order gives no expiration date. Are you and Mayor Bowser coordinating at all? Is it fair to say that you are not on the same page about the best way to go toe-to-toe with this administration?
Well, look, I know whether it's Mayor Bowser or whether it's Mayor Karen Bass or if it's, Mayor Brandon Scott in Baltimore, we all want to build safe communities, right? That is, I believe, everyone's number one priority. Now, I put forth an executive order just this past weekend to give clear direction and guidance to how we prepare for, what essentially is an illegal, unconstitutional act. In fact, my executive order has been affirmed by the federal courts already, because the acts that this president engaged in have been deemed as illegal and unconstitutional. Look, the bottom line is this president is not serious about driving violence down across America, because if he were, he would be talking to mayors like myself and asking us what's working. There's a lot of work to be done, but look, I wake up on the west side of Chicago. I go to bed on the west side of Chicago, a community that has been disinvested in historically, and we have certainly had our challenges. Every time someone gets harmed by violence, we're talking about my neighbors, it breaks my heart, but it also reaffirms my resolve to ensure that we make the necessary investments to drive violence down. This president is trampling on our Constitution. He's behaving in a way that is undermining our democracy, and he's trying to get us to submit our humanity to his will. That's not what we're going to do in the city of Chicago. We're going to stand up for working people, make the necessary investments, hold the people accountable who are causing harm, but we need this president to actually show up with real investments. If he were serious, why did he cut 30% of the budget of ATF? 1,465 Americans who have been serving in these capacities got cut from his budget. For what? To militarize ICE, his own private security entity that causes harm and terror against communities. This president is reprehensible, his behavior at this moment. And that's why we're standing firm in the city of Chicago to protect people, to stand up for people, and then to invest in people. That's how we're building the safest, most affordable big city in America.
Mayor Johnson, I talked to a number of people today that said you are, in fact, finding the strength to fight back, and a number of people that said, well, you are in a different situation than Mayor Bowser is in. That being said, something happened at the presser today that you all said that we want to get some more clarity on. The governor said during the press conference that they have reason to believe, you all, that the Texas National Guard has been mobilized and is staging. What makes you all so sure of that? And are you planning some preemptive legal action? And if so, why not just announce it today?
Well, first of all, the governor has received intel on good word that that's what their motivation is, because he can't federalize the National Guard here in Illinois. So he's going to go to Republican states to abuse his power. In terms of a preemptive act, obviously, if there's no crime that has been executed, there's no legal action that we can take preemptively, right? But I can say this: we have sued this government, the federal administration, multiple times, over 40 cases. We saw one where we just beat the Trump administration when he tried to withhold resources from cities like Chicago, who are welcoming cities. We put forth this executive order to make a clear distinction here. We're going to protect the people of this city. This president, I believe, has caused so much turmoil, not just across America, but around the globe. The illegal implementation of his taxes have already been determined that most of them are illegal. This president can care less about the people who are struggling in our country. I remember a time, Michael, when presidents declared wars on poverty. This president has declared war on poor people. If you look at the arrests that he made primarily in D.C., the vast majority of them were for traffic offenses as well as citations and misdemeanors. This president is not serious about driving violence down in the city of Chicago. This is about distraction, distracting people away from his failures. When the labor numbers don't work out in his favor, he puts forth another stunt. When his illegal activity and his proclivities are exposed, he puts forth another political stunt. I grew up in the 90s. He needs to quit stunting and actually do his job by investing in people. That's how we drive violence down in the city of Chicago. That's what I'm doing, building affordable homes, standing up for working people, making sure that we have employment opportunities for our young people, making sure that we're investing in our police department with strategies that work.